revolution is on. Today, on The Simple Truth, we consecrate everything to the Sacred Heart of Jesus through the Immaculate Heart of Mary and the pure, strong, chaste heart of St. Joseph. I'm your host, Jim Havens, and our guest today is Dr. Nathanael Blake. He's a fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. He received his doctorate from the Catholic University of America, and he's the author of the new book, Victims of the Revolution, How Sexual Liberation Hurts Us All. It's published by Ignatius Press. You can get it at ignatius.com. Dr. Nathanael Blake, welcome to The Simple Truth. How are you today?
I'm doing well. Thank you very much for having me.
Absolutely. Yeah, I read every word of this book. Phenomenal. Excited to dive into it with you. And we're going to do that in just a moment. But first, want to remind everybody about iCatholic Mobile. It's the only Catholic mobile phone company in the U.S. today. When you subscribe to iCatholic Mobile, you help fund the Station of the Cross. Check out iCatholic Mobile, iCatholicMobile.com. All right. Again, very much enjoyed this book. Found it very helpful. Dr. Blake, can you give us the backstory? Why this book? Why now?
Well, nobody sets out, I think, to be a professional prude. It's just something you wander into when you keep writing about how our sexual culture is broken and how it's not delivering on its promises. And that turned into a book. And it is true that the world, our culture is starting to realize something went wrong. We've got The Atlantic writing about how there's a sex recession. The New Yorker just ran a piece on the same thing. Why aren't young people having more sex? So the sexual revolution promised we'd be happy, we'd be fulfilled, we'd be authentic, and we'd have a lot of great sex. And none of that came true. So I think it's time to argue, look, the reason it went wrong is because Christianity was true. The people who were dismissed as the killjoys, the scolds, the prudes, the bigots were right. And they were right because they understand truths about human nature rooted in Scripture, in the teaching of Christianity that explain how we are to live, which is for our good and the good of those around us in this life.
Absolutely, yeah. Very much agree with the conclusions that you land on in this book, and really appreciate it as we got to the end of the book here. Yeah, as those conclusions kind of played out, and you get into the the Christian teaching on sexual ethics, but overall, the Christian proposition is true. It is real, and it has ramifications that obviously are extremely important, and you can't just discard these things and throw them away. And you really make some really wonderful connections. Very, very helpful. But tell us about the flow of the book as you organize this and put it together. What is the journey you're seeking to take the reader on here?
So I start simply with the point that something, as I mentioned, has gone wrong. And the simple truth is that people are not having the great time that they were promised. They're not having the authentic freedom they were promised. And we're seeing, again, the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Atlantic, all of these publications that are not conservative Christian or conservative Catholic outlets, nonetheless running pieces admitting that we have a porn problem in our culture, that we have a problem of young men and young women not coming together, not connecting with each other, not forming stable relationships. So I begin with that something is wrong, and even the people who championed the sexual revolution are starting to realize that something is wrong. Then I explore, how did this go wrong? What are ways in which it's wrong? And specifically, I talk about victims, because our culture loves to talk about victimhood, except when it comes to sex. There we don't talk about the consequences. We don't talk about the people who are hurt by our sexual culture, which has wandered very far from any Christian truth. So that's the progression as I look at abortion, and I look at transgenderism and gender ideology. I look at the LGBT movement and all of these things. And then I turn to how does Christianity provide a better way to live? Not a perfect way to live, because we're still sinners in a fallen world, but a way that is ordered towards our good and that provides both a way of life that avoids the pitfalls of sin, that promises true love, and provides comfort and sanctification even amidst sorrow. So that's sort of the progression throughout the book.
Yes, Dr. Nathanael Blake is with us. We're talking about his book, Victims of the Revolution, How Sexual Liberation Hurts Us All. You can find it at ignatius.com. And so many places to dive in here. But let's go to the place a little bit later in the book where you do start to lay out just the radical nature of what Christianity brings in terms of looking at it historically of when it first began with Jesus and his apostles, and then with the church and the early church. And this was a very different way of life than how most people were living, especially with regard to sexual ethics, sexual integrity. Can you help paint that picture for us? Tell us a little bit more about that.
Sure. So the Christian Revolution was, as Kyle Harper, who's a historian, put it in a piece for First Things a few years back, the first sexual revolution, because it overturned pagan sexuality. Pagan sexuality was exploitative. It was premised on the predominance and the dominance of the free male citizen. So it was hierarchical, and it was untroubled by hypocrisy because it didn't see any hypocrisy in, say, a free man using prostitutes, using slaves sexually, because that wasn't adultery for him. It was simply presumed that that's what men did, and of course women couldn't do that. And in contrast, then we see the Apostle Paul writing to all of these churches throughout the Roman world, and in multiple places from Corinthians, Ephesians, Romans, laying out a radical sexual ethic that says, no, sex is not simply an indulgence that is ordered according to who is powerful. Instead, it is something that directs us towards a higher purpose, towards our ultimate fulfillment with Christ, the union of Christ and his bride, the church. But it is also something that is important in this life, because our bodies matter, and defilement of our bodies because of our identification with Christ is a defilement of Christ. So all of these things get brought in that are just mind-blowing, I think, in that Roman culture. But it was also, Christianity then revolutionized this because it also was kinder. It didn't discard children who are unwanted. It didn't tolerate prostitution and slavery, which were very much entwined. Instead, it protected the weak, protected the vulnerable, and it insisted that men and women be held to the same sexual standard, as opposed to presuming that, of course, there'd be a double standard there.
Into what's very striking is I love how you include different scripture citations. You bring us right into them, and what the scriptures actually say, what Paul is actually saying to the Romans and elsewhere. And when you read it, when you dive in and you remember what was actually taking place at that time, and how clear the proclamation was, we still have the same teaching. The teaching hasn't changed with respect to the church. In fact, you can open up the Catechism of the Catholic Church and find a beautiful layout of the church's teaching on sexual integrity and what it all means and how it all works. Wonderful. At the same time, though, that isn't being vigorously proclaimed as it ought to be in a culture that has gone the exact opposite way, basically. Even so many who even would say they are Christian or are Catholic are rejecting essential aspects of the teaching, specifically when it comes to sexual morality or the nature of our sexuality. And so if we got back to that proclamation that we see in Paul and in others in the early church, probably would be very fruitful. Why do you think that we don't see more of that in terms of when we know that that's what's needed in a time that is in grave error and going in the wrong direction here? Why not stronger, more bold preaching on the truths of it, which we have? We just need to unleash it and let people know about it.
Well, I think we got very used to losing, right? We felt like we were on the back foot constantly as the sexual revolution won victory after victory. So just in the last 10 years, we saw that shift from Obergefell makes gay marriage a mandate across the country in terms of it must be recognized. And then suddenly there was this shift towards transgenderism, and it felt like we were getting beaten back on that as well. And finally, we're starting to make progress on that. We've also seen progress on abortion, the overturning of Roe v. Wade. It took 50 50 years, but we did that. But I think a lot of people were very discouraged, very defeatist, and also some of the consequences weren't fully apparent yet. But now that we really are seeing that, no, it's not a good time out there. It's not a wonderful party that everybody's enjoying and there's no negative consequences or negative externalities. I think you're right that this is precisely a time to be bold, to speak up, and to say both that there have been serious evils inflicted by this sexual ethos that our culture has embraced, but also that Christianity points us to something better, something beautiful, something that is difficult and hard at times, but provides much more fulfillment, the prospect of both uniting with one person for life, which allows for intimacy that is unavailable in random hookups or autonomistic pleasure seeking, while at the same time also, again, directing us towards our ultimate fulfillment, our eschatological fulfillment, and our union with Christ.
Yeah, we're going to get to a lot more here with Dr. Nathanael Blake as we go today. So we're going to be back in just a moment. But again, you can get the book over at Ignatius.com, Victims of the Revolution, How Sexual Liberation Hurts Us All. A lot more to dive into. And, it strikes me that, really calling people on to humility, and maybe not normally what people would think of humility, but just this disposition of we are to receive something here, everything, in fact, from God, our very existence, but also how things work, how things are, to receive the truth of that and to live according to that, not try to say, yeah, no, I'm going to do it my way and forget about this. We're going to make it in our image. We're going to be right back. Stay tuned.
Tired of your phone bill supporting who knows what? iCatholic Mobile is a 5G provider that supports what matters to you. With iCatholic Mobile, every call, text, and even that group chat you can't escape helps support the Station of the Cross. It's a network that connects you to what's good for both your soul and your wallet. More information is available at iCatholicMobile.com. iCatholic Mobile underwrites with the Station of the Cross.
Welcome back to The Simple Truth. Jim Havens here with our guest today, Dr. Nathanael Blake, talking about his book, Victims of the Revolution, How Sexual Liberation Hurts Us All. You can get it at the publisher, Ignatius Press, Ignatius.com, wherever you find books, and grab it there. Also, support your local Catholic bookstore, if you would. That's always a great idea. And we're going to dive back in just a moment. But first, if you are buying or selling a home, there's an easy way to help the Station of the Cross at the same time. Real Estate for Life. It has 1,400 experienced, morally grounded agents in the U.S. and Canada. Visit realestateforlife.org to find a Christ-centered, experienced realtor near you. And don't forget to mention the Station of the Cross. All right, let's dive back into the book. In Chapter 1, From Liberation to Loneliness, Dr. Blake writes as follows: though some of these reasons are more compelling than others, it is clear that our culture is not delivering what people want and need in the way of family formation, and yet little is done to rectify this. Even to raise these issues in normative terms is to risk denunciation. We are told to view marriage and children as optional objects of subjective desire rather than a norm that culture is built around. It is socially acceptable to say that it is unfortunate when people who want to get married and have children do not. It is unacceptable to say that marriage and parenthood are vocations that most of us are called to and that society should be organized around them. Our culture does not want to admit that men and women have a natural need to come together to form families and that this is the best way of life for most of us. Though lip service is given to the idea that there is nothing more important than family, in practice we are taught that all sorts of ambitions and acquisitions are more important. So this would be an area to hold the line, to just say that this is what is normal and for a good reason, that most of us are called to marriage and family, and that this is good. And so this has been largely lost today in our culture, sadly, to disastrous effect. Dr. Blake, anything more you want to share on this?
Well, I think that, I like the words I wrote. They're not impromptu, but I would add that we're finally seeing concern about falling birth rates become mainstream. But we can't address that by simply throwing a bit more money at it. You need a cultural shift in which people value marriage and having children, raising children, much more than they do a few more material acquisitions, a few more trips, a few more vacations, a nicer car, a slightly more career advancement, whatever. So it's a question of what do we value? Do you believe that people, and specifically for those called to marriage and family, which again, most of us, that people are the most important thing, and that is the most fulfilling thing in this life, and the best thing? Or is it instead that you think those are nice, but you think that advancing more in your career is more important, or making more money, or going on nicer vacations? And our culture still, it talks about family, but the practice of our culture, the overriding message is you want to be the greatest you can be individually, and then you can add family into that rather than putting family first.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yeah, very well said. And we've got to make these arguments and win these arguments in our culture. If only family members, extended family, coworkers, whatever it is, when we have conversations on these topics. And these are arguments that should not be difficult for us to make. They are things that are common sense. And yet, the further we've gone down this slippery slope, though it may be, although it's taken many decades, I guess you see the fallout of all of this. And I guess what is a little bit odd, being at this point, is to kind of look back and think, well, wasn't this obvious? Wouldn't this have been obvious at the time? If you go forth with this idea that we can just, remove the marital act, the act of sex from marriage, if we just try to say, you know what, I know that children naturally result from sexual union oftentimes, but we're going to get workarounds. We're going to, use technology to get around that, the pill, and then other contraceptive devices and things, and then abortion as a sort of backup, and then all of these evils that result. Wouldn't it be clear that this was going to be a very bad idea from the beginning? Couldn't all of this devastation in some way be predicted, if not precisely so, at least generally speaking? We know that there are going to be very bad fruits from going this direction. Anything from the time, as you kind of look back through the history of this, anything from the time, was there any sounding of the alarm back then? Do we have to wait, I guess, for all of these bits of evidence to now come down the line so that we can use these in our arguments? Couldn't this have been argued early on without, I guess, all the evidence? Any thought on that?
Well, I think it was argued, but a lot of those warnings were ignored. I mean, Humanae Vitae, of course, being one of the great Catholic documents discussing this, that encyclical, but also you had plenty of people, Catholics, Protestants, even some secular writers, are making the point that this was not going to go well. But ultimately, we thought we could get away with it. Jennifer Morse, I was talking with her, and she kind of summed up a lot of my book that way, that our culture thought we were wealthy enough, we were technologically adept enough, that we could avoid a lot of the negative consequences of sexual liberation. And it turns out it didn't go as well as we thought it would culturally. But ultimately, there was also simply this shift that people didn't quite realize, but which they welcomed in their own lives, away from an idea of people as intrinsically ordered towards each other, and instead towards an autonomous ideal that people are meant to, we thrive when we seek our own pleasure, our own interest, as opposed to the Christian idea, which is we are made for love and we thrive in relationship with others, which will often entail self-sacrifice and obligation, but far from losing ourselves in that we find ourselves, in Christ's words, if you lose your life, you will find it precisely by giving away ourselves to others. That self-gift is then returned to us, and we find that we become deeper and more fully ourselves because our relationships and our love have deepened.
Yeah, Dr. Nathanael Blake is with us. And so, there are still many who are unconvinced, even after all the evidence has kind of come down that we have now. You lay so much of it out in the book that is very helpful and very difficult to face. especially for those that might not be very familiar with a lot of it. There's various things that I was not familiar with, a sense of, things are a lot, even though you might think things are pretty bad, they're a lot worse than you think they are, in the sense of the dark areas that you look at here. I would say on the flip side, though, God's grace and the things that are good, true, and beautiful are much more so than we might even imagine. And so there is this sort of juxtaposition between the two. The light and the darkness certainly lines up with divine revelation and the Christian understanding of things. But there are some who, different people want to, I guess, roll things back to a different point or stop things now as things start to roll towards now polygamy. Is that going to be a new civil right like we see with transgenderism that has been pushed? Now that's where the battle kind of has been fought with men entering women's sports and various things. We've seen a lot of pushback there that has been good. But all of this still flows from so-called same-sex marriage, which is still very much something that seems like the vast majority of people in our nation are on board with. And then you've got all of the other evils that have been around for a great while, but then, they've become more culturally accepted. Divorce, adultery, pornography, prostitution, masturbation, fornication. You've got the pill, which kind of kicked this whole thing off, this sort of this normal way of then seeing things as sort of consumption rather than really something to be reverenced. The gift of life and the way man and woman are made and the way we are meant to complement each other and the way we're called to marriage and the way we're called to this one flesh union of marriage and this indissoluble commitment to one another, which protects the child and benefits the child and benefits the family and in the image of the Trinity. So beautiful. And so I guess it seems in your book, you're saying, look, we've got to go back to the beginning on this, and it's all really of one piece, and we've got to start proclaiming the full truth of it all. Other people want to pick different points and say, let's go back to this point or this point. What do you have to say to those that maybe just want to roll it back a little bit? Do we have to roll it back all the way? What are your thoughts?
Well, I think we do, and for reasons you just talked about. So Andrew Sullivan, who's a very prominent writer, one of the leading advocates for same-sex marriage back when that was still considered a radical idea as opposed to what it is now, the law of the land. He just had a piece in the New York Times which basically repeated arguments that he'd made before that I addressed in the book, but saying this transgender thing has gone too far, let's roll it back. And it was same-sex marriage was different. But the problem is, if the differences between men and women don't matter in marriage, they don't matter anywhere. You can't say that the difference between a male and a female matters only insofar as it's a subjective sense of desire of what you want sexually, the sort of body you desire to interact with sexually, and then say that, but it matters very much elsewhere. No, either it matters, and it really matters, including in marriage, especially in marriage, or it doesn't matter. So there's that inconsistency, and we ultimately do need to strive for a stable understanding of the human person, which Christianity offers amidst a modernity, a postmodernity that says everything is liquid, everything's dissolvable, everything is subject to whim. Christianity says, no, the human person has an enduring nature given to us by God, and we can rebel against that to our detriment, or we can strive to live in accordance with it, which will be for our good and the good of those around us, and will provide us with a source of truth even when times are hard. Even when we do suffer, as we will in this fallen world, we will have the suffering for the truth, the suffering within the truth, rather than suffering within a meaningless void where nothing matters but our own desires.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you speak to the vision of things very well in the book, and yeah, there's this sense that yes, rolling things back, okay, but not just rolling things back. In fact, maybe a better way to say it is that at the end of all of this here, where we are today, it's not going back. That's oftentimes what the detractors, what those who want to keep going in this so-called sexual revolution will say to us, hey, you just want to turn back the clock to the way things used to be. It's like, no, we now want to take full recourse of everything that has taken place up to this point and say, look, let's come together and let's build our culture and have public policy that reflects the true nature of things. Even before the so-called sexual revolution, there were problems, right? That we don't want to go back to problems. We don't want to go back to a world like a sort of Mad Men world of the 50s where you have like, an exploitative culture at work towards women and all of this. That's not what we're looking for at all. We're looking for a culture that is based on the true nature of things, and that people that are virtuous and are wanting to live according to the good. We're going to be right back. Stay tuned. Let's get into talking a little bit here about public policy and what we would want to see moving forward. What should we be pushing for, working for in terms of public policy in this area? Specifically, well, one thing that I was very glad to see is in chapter 2 of the book, Abortion Hardens the Hearts, It Doesn't Stop, is your citing of John Finnis's work, specifically his article in First Things, Abortion is Unconstitutional, where you make the remark there's a much stronger case that the Constitution forbids elective abortion than it requires it, which is something that we very much support here, and we agree with the scholarship of John Finnis, Dr. Robert George, Josh Craddock, Hadley Arkus, many others who have made this argument and have done the scholarship, done the work on it. We're trying to say, hey, can we educate more people on this and actually get the pro-life movement to get on board with calling for what we believe is the strategy to have. The easiest way to do it would be if we could get our president to sign an executive order saying that abortion is in fact unconstitutional under the Equal Protection Clause in the 14th Amendment already, and that immediately would take it out of politics basically and kick it right back to the Supreme Court, force them to deal with that question, which is something they've been unwilling to do, but this would force them to deal with the question. We believe the current makeup of the court very likely to have if they are forced to answer that question, they would have a favorable answer to that question, and that abortion could very well be made unconstitutional if some action was taken with that regard. I think that might be a lot easier than maybe some of these other things we're seeing with the transgenderism, with so-called same-sex marriage and so-called gay rights and these things, because the Supreme Court has really bought in to the whole legal structure, has bought into these things being identities and civil rights. So all that needs to really be rolled back. Can you speak to that argument of why these aren't civil rights, why these aren't identities, and what actually needs to be done, I guess, legally to get onto the other side of these?
So the strategy pursued by the gay rights movement and then by the transgender rights movement, which sort of tagged along until it was its turn, has been to try to treat opposition the same way that racist segregation was treated, and to squash it using the same incredible power of the federal government. So that has been the effort to enshrine these as a civil rights issue. And the problem is, well, there are a lot of problems with that, but one problem is simply that the whole narrative used to push this was false. Some listeners may have been fortunate enough to avoid it, but most of us probably heard the Lady Gaga song, Born This Way. And that was the mantra. You're born this way, and therefore it is your identity, and it is wrong and discriminatory to not support your sexual identity or your gender identity. These need to be treated the same way that we treat issues of racial discrimination. But that's not true. There is no gay gene. That search ended in failure a few years ago. It turns out that sexual desire is complex. There's a lot of factors. It's going to vary from person to person. Gender identity, meanwhile, is even more nebulous. And in fact, it is ultimately superstitious nonsense. It's like astrology. To say that there's some sort of gendered soul that can be put into the wrong body is a metaphysical claim that is utterly unverifiable, that's not backed up, and that is, of course, inconsistent with with Christian understanding of the human person. So legally, what we really need to seek to do is simply have the courts proclaim the simple truths about who we are as male and female, that recognizing that we are male and female first with regards to transgenderism is not discriminatory, it's not bigoted, it's simply reality. With regard to same-sex marriage and issues of that, it is recognizing that there is a normativity to our male and female nature such that men and women are not interchangeable. You can't simply take two men and say, oh, that's a marriage, because there is in fact a reality at play here with regard to our bodies not merely being clay or something we're stuck with but not our true selves. No, our bodies matter. They are who we are because we are that union of body and soul.
Yeah, I was thinking as you're speaking and thinking about the Supreme Court on this, what is your thought on where they currently are? Are they open to such arguments? Are people making these arguments before the court? What are you noticing there?
Well, so some of my colleagues are much more involved and insightful in the legal area than I am, but it does seem like the court is moving in our direction. The Scarametti case that was decided, where it was affirmed that Tennessee can prohibit sex change procedures, so-called. They don't really change sex, of course, but they try to at least create the appearance of a sex change. Anyway, those can be prohibited for minors, and of course that will also then apply to a whole bunch of other states that have passed similar restrictions. We're going to see a lot of Trump's executive actions on transgenderism upheld to the extent that those are being challenged in court. So I think the Supreme Court is moving in our direction. They do tend to be cautious. So, for example, when it came to the mifepristone decision, so that's the abortion pill, ultimately what they did was they punted. They didn't want to decide, so they simply said the plaintiffs don't have standing, therefore they can't sue, so we don't have to give a decision on this. So I do think that they are cautious. They don't want to decide some issues if they can avoid it, but I think they're moving in the right direction, and it's going to be a matter of finding the right mix of policy changes, whether at the state level or executive actions at the federal level, as well as the right legal cases to nudge the Supreme Court along without getting too far past their comfort zone.
I also am reminded of Justice Anthony Kennedy's majority opinion in Planned Parenthood versus Casey. I was thinking about this as I was reading the book. I mean, he basically made a statement there that very much goes along with the ideology of the so-called sexual revolution, gender revolution as well. He said, at the heart of liberty is the right to define one's own concept of existence, of meaning, of the universe, and of the mystery of human life. Dr. Blake, what are your thoughts when you think about that quote by Justice Kennedy?
Well, it's ridiculous because that presumes, well, it's nihilistic ultimately. It presumes that there is no truth, not only that, which it would be very defensible, that humans have a limited access to the truth, that our facilities for reasoning are clouded by our limitations, by sin a lot of the time, and so on. Those are all things Christians would say and agree with, but this went further. It presumed that it was just relativistic nihilism. And the problem is relativistic nihilism is a terrible way to run a society. It's a terrible way to live. And that is part of what we're seeing, is that to the extent that this ideology is accepted by people, it leaves them despairing, it leaves them hopeless, because all they have is the pursuit of temporary pleasures that they find don't satisfy them, that don't give them meaning. They have the pursuit of autonomy for the sake of autonomy, which leaves them alone. It breaks apart the bonds and ties that give meaning to life to a large extent. It leaves them separated from other people. It leaves them alienated from themselves because they don't know who they are, and it separates them from God. Whereas Christianity says, no, there is a solution. It's understanding who you are as a creature of God. You don't create your own reality. Instead, you recognize as best as you can the reality that God has given you. And you find your meaning, you find your purpose through love for your fellow man, and then ultimately for God.
Yeah, and I think you make that argument in the book as well, that that when you really strip it all back, I mean, what this all is it's a revolution against God. And so I guess that is the point where what kind of argument should we be making in the public square on these grounds, that's what seems maybe most unpopular of all, in terms of it seems like people are so entrenched in what was sold to them as sort of being tolerant of all and of, one big melting pot, and every sort of religious belief is the same as any other. And we're not going to give any more privileges to a Christian version of things. But really, there really does have to be a primacy of the Judeo-Christian worldview and ethic, which is what Western civilization is built on. And getting back to these foundational principles, are those really the points we need to be making and arguing from? Anything else that you can guide us with here?
Well, I think, yes, and I think it can help us to make the point that the precepts of Christianity when it comes to these issues, marriage, family, sexuality, and so on, are not arbitrary, they're not capricious, they're not idiosyncratic observances of mere ritual. Rather, they are rooted in human nature, and therefore they direct us towards our good and the good of those around us. They direct us individually, in family and community, and ultimately as a nation towards genuine human flourishing, genuine thriving. So we can see that play out. As we have abandoned these things, as people have rejected them, it hasn't delivered. That's the premise of the book, is that the sexual revolution made a lot of promises that it hasn't kept. Right? If you've been to a baptism lately, you've said, I reject Satan and all his empty promises. Do you do that? I do. Well, we say that because Satan's promises are empty. Pleasure and fulfillment and all of these things have not come to pass, even as they've been frantically pursued in our culture. So I think that point is where we can reach people, that there is an emptiness there that we can direct people's attention to, because they are so often experiencing it themselves, and because look, there's a better way of life. And what you see from that is there really is a human nature, and the Christian precepts that talk about that are premised on that, are true, because the reality, their truth, is being borne out experientially.
Yes, Dr. Nathanael Blake is with us. Victims of the Revolution, How Sexual Liberation Hurts Us All, Ignatius.com. That point that you're putting forward there, just very, very important, because I think it's also important to say with that, along with that, look, we have the truth in this area. That's why this hasn't worked, because we went against it. But we've never really fully sought to live it out to the full. In fact, I think you mentioned in here having a sort of humility about past mistakes in Christianity and saying, look, there's been a lot of corruption in terms of not really following our own teachings. And look, the answer is to actually be faithful to them. And we've not been a very good example oftentimes throughout history. And so let's do the thing we've not done yet, and let's really see the society flourish by saying, look, this is true. Let's all be faithful to it. Your thoughts?
Yes. I say at several points in the book that we've been guilty, that we have never achieved, a perfect culture of Christian sexual morality. And we never will. However, that changeover from saying, well, this is the ideal, and then not always living up to it to varying degrees, both individually and culturally, to a completely different an ideal that rejects Christian sexual morality, has been devastating. It's made things worse. It's not that things were perfect, but a lot of things have gotten worse. So one obvious example, of course, is simply family. And what would be the best educational program in this country? What would be the best anti-crime program in this country? What would be the best anti-poverty program in this country? It would simply be fathers who married the mothers of their children and stayed married to them and took care of their families. That's a basic social justice issue that we could radically improve society if people simply did that.
Absolutely, yes. Dr. Nathanael Blake is with us. So well said, and so much more in the book. We can't get to all of it, but you can get the book and read it in its entirety. I highly recommend you do so. Again, Victims of the Revolution. You can find it at Ignatius.com. We still have one more segment to go, so we're going to pack in as much as we can there. But just know that this is good, true, and beautiful. The virtue of chastity, sexual integrity, to really live with fidelity, one's marriage vows, to really love one's spouse and one's children. We're going to be right back. Stay tuned. Dr. Blake, I want to give you the floor here in this final segment. Anything that you want to lift out from the book that you want to share with us today as being most important, essential for us to understand?
Well, I think one point I'd want to briefly address is simply the mention of abortion. Culture's understanding of abortion is so much shaped by a false idea of what it is to be human. There is that asymmetry of human reproduction. It imposes more burdens on women, and that's treated as a problem to be solved instead of the solidarity that comes together in love. Mother, father, and child, we have this rejection and instead a selfish clash of interests. And ultimately that just degrades women and children, because if being human means being maximally free, and if dependence then is a burden, then of course children in particular are going to be seen as less than human because they impose burdens on us. Women, when they are burdened by pregnancy, is again seeing it as a burden, will want to get rid of that because it makes them seem less than human. So instead of loving the vulnerable, loving the dependent, and caring for them out of solidarity, they're rejected. And then this creates pressure to turn away from them. So that's one point that I think is just important. It's just how cruel abortion is, just what a rejection of human solidarity and love it is. And then that leads me to the next point, which is that there is a vulnerability to love. Loving other people, I've talked a lot about how we find our fulfillment in love and relationships, and that's true. But it does open us up to being hurt. But that vulnerability, one, is unavoidable if we are to love. And two, we can, in that vulnerability, recognize the example of Christ, who became maximally vulnerable for us, who suffered and died for us. God, in the second person of the Trinity, suffered and died out of love. And so in our difficulties, in our sorrows, in our sufferings, we can look to that as an example of hope, of courage, and recognize that our sufferings can be a small part, a small participation in the suffering of Christ, trending both towards the good of this world now and towards our own sanctification.
Yeah, it really gets to the heart of it all, and at the same time is a point that you would hope anybody would be able to recognize the genius of Christianity in this, the fact that when someone is most vulnerable, most dependent, most in need, we ought to help them. We wouldn't, that's not the point where we dehumanize them and discard them because they are a burden on us. I would hope that any rational, sane person would be able to agree with that. Well, we need Christianity in our culture because Christianity is the one that makes that point the best very strongly, and not just makes the point. And I think this is one of the most important points we need to make, is that it is real. And so therefore, this is actually something where on our own, we can do nothing. We can do very little. We can maybe understand a bit of this, but sin is going to blind us. Our fallenness is going to be big trouble for us, but by God's grace, which has been poured out for us. And so to receive the grace of God, and to say yes to what God wants to give to us, this gift of his very self to us. He wants to share his very life with us. If we can enter into that, then we actually can do things that on our own, we would never be able to do, such as be able to reach out in love for our neighbors in ways that, maybe we could never, we just continue to trip over ourselves in selfishness. But I do want to point out this quote from C.S. Lewis that you leave in the conclusion here that I think is so wonderful, and get your thoughts on it. He writes this, he says, "To love at all is to be vulnerable. Love anything, and your heart will certainly be wrung and possibly be broken. If you want to make sure of keeping it intact, you must give your heart to no one. Avoid all entanglements. Lock it up, safe in the casket or coffin of your selfishness. But in that casket, safe, dark, motionless, airless, it will change. It will not be broken. It will become unbreakable, impenetrable, irredeemable. The alternative to tragedy, or at least to the risk of tragedy, is damnation. The only place outside heaven where you can be perfectly safe from all the dangers and perturbations of love is hell. So in that clever way that C.S. Lewis does, points out a very important truth. If we are just in terms of self-protection and hide our hearts away, lock them up, then we cannot open our hearts to God's grace for us and to all that we are called to in terms of giving and receiving love. And this is really at the core of what it really means to be authentically human. So one last thing I do want to say and get your thoughts on is that I love that you write in here about how the transgender movement in particular, they're making a metaphysical argument. They're saying that someone is born in the wrong body. What does that even mean? They run away from it if you try to talk metaphysics with them. But it opens, I think, an opportunity to say, let's talk some metaphysics. Yes, we are body and soul, but it doesn't work the way you think it does. You've got some wrong thinking there. Let me share with you how this does work, right? And you go into this, the eschatological aspect of humanity, which is wonderful to ponder and to just understand that there is so much more than just this life, but there is a way that we are called to live this life by God's grace, and that we ought to be embracing Christian sexual ethics as the great gift that they are, not trying to remake it in some different image because we just want to do what we want to do. Dr. Blake, share with us anything that you want to share.
I mean, I think that's a great jumping off point, which is that, again, it's this understanding of who we are as people. And if you're autonomous and pleasure-seeking, you will be selfish and you'll lock your heart away. But again, when you do that, you not only damage your relationship with God ultimately, but you make yourself more miserable in this life, because in this life, you're still meant for love. You're meant for relationship with other people. And one of the points that I want to emphasize, and that I think Christians should emphasize, is the beauty of marriage. Marriage is incredibly romantic and courageous if undertaken in the spirit Christianity tells us to. These vows, we don't do a lot of oaths in our culture anymore. Oath-taking, oath-breaking aren't big concepts for us. But this is powerful. For better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, till death do us part. That is something that is profound. It's not disappearing into a gray suburbia the way so much entertainment tells us marriage is. Instead, this is a struggle for your whole life, for your spouse, and against yourself, against the world if it comes to that, saying, I will keep my promises. And this keeping of promises is one of the most profound ways that we are human, that we can assert ourselves as agents. Hannah Arendt, the philosopher, makes this point that it is in the keeping of promises that we are truly human. We're not just reactive against the world. And this is, our culture tells us, keep your options open, react to what the world does, and be supple, be free to do what you think is best in the moment. But that makes you just a slave to the world, a slave to your desires, instead asserting yourself and keeping to what you have promised you will be, keeping to what you have said you will be. That is the true nobility. That is an incredible, powerful adventure. And we, of course, need God's grace for that, both as we keep our promises to others and ultimately to Him. But it is a beautiful thing to attempt. It is a romantic, in the full sense, thing to attempt. Trying to live up to these vows of, I will cleave to you, I will forsake all others, and I will make this relationship deep with you and ignore the rest of the world, to take on the rest of the world for you, for your sake.
Yeah, wonderful. Well said. And you write about that in the book even more. Again, just want to highly recommend it. Victims of the Revolution, How Sexual Liberation Hurts Us All. You can get it at Ignatius.com. Dr. Nathanael Blake, thank you so much for being with us today, for writing the book, for all your good work.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Absolutely. And I just want to encourage everybody, look, in my experience, I've been married almost 17 years now. Look, I love being married. I love being a dad to a bunch of kids that we have, and not always easy, very difficult. It stretches you, but that's what love is. That's what you're made for. God bless you all.